Hi everyone, it's Ardith, and today I have a lazy daisy frame card using some products from A Jillian Vance Design. I call it lazy because I cheated, and I cut a few corners on my masking and measuring here, and I'll share some tips with you as I get to them. I started with a panel of white cardstock and my original sized MISTI since I needed space to stamp off the edge of the panel. I chose the largest daisy arrangement from the new Dear Daisy stamp set, and I placed it along the top edge of my panel. I lined up the right edge of my panel along a grid line in case I needed to restamp it, but I didn't. I used Gina K amalgam ink so that I could do some COPIC coloring later on. When I had the first edge stamped, I simply turned the panel 180 degrees and inked it up and stamped it again. Now for some reason I was feeling really lazy, and I was seriously hoping that I wouldn't need to mask this at all, and the daisy image would fit perfectly into that space along the long sides of my panel, but it didn't quite fit. So here's my first lazy tip. I didn't re-ink the stamp to create my masks. I just pressed the pad of the sticky notes onto the ends of the image. The impression was pretty faint because it had been stamped off once, but it was easy enough to see. I used scissors to quickly cut out the two masks. I didn't worry too much about precision. I figured I could draw in any missing lines once I had the daisy stamped again. I lined up my panel so that I wouldn't even have to clean and move the stamp, and then I inked up the image again and I stamped it along that edge. Then I flipped the panel, moved the masks, and stamped it for a fourth time, and my frame is done. This minimal amount of lazy masking created a continuous image around the edge of my frame. I did feel like there was room to add a couple more daisies in the corners, so I created one more mask, cleaned and moved the stamp so that just the end daisy would show, and then I stamped it before flipping the panel and stamping it again. I could have covered the whole panel with daisies, but honestly I was feeling too lazy to cut more masks, so I decided to work with what I had. My brain was already thinking ahead to a tall sentiment to put in the center, and we'll come to that after the coloring. Now there's no getting away from the fact that there's a lot of coloring on this card, but I do have a couple of lazy tips for coloring. First, I chose an image that had a lot of repetition, so that meant a lot of flower centers, leaves, and petals. The first lazy tip is to limit the colors you're using, and the second lazy tip is to do all of one color at one time. This saves a lot of time picking up, taking off caps, putting down, and putting caps back on. I wanted colors that were appropriate for late summer, early autumn, and I started with browns for the flower centers. I went over each center with the lightest color, then created dimension with the mid-tone and the darkest shades, before going over the whole thing again with the lightest shade. Then I moved on to the leaves. Same process, lightest green all over, mid-tone and darker along the bottom left edges to create some contrast and shadows. Finally, it was time for the daisies themselves. I chose some dull yellows, but I didn't do all of the flowers. I thought it would be fun to have some pops of a coral pink in the arrangement, and that must have overridden my otherwise lazy day. Anyway, I followed the same process with my 3 yellow markers, using the darkest one to create the shadows on the layers of petals. When I was finished, I felt like the flowers were a bit too brown, so I grabbed a very bright yellow and I used it to go over all of the petals and give it a more sunny look. Finally, the pinks. I chose some dull pinks and corals to fit with my early autumn theme, and I did the exact same process again. It always amazes me how easy it is to create the look of depth with just 3 shades of one color. When I finished, I felt like the contrast between the richly colored flowers and that white center was a bit too stark, so I used some pale toner gray markers to create a soft dotted background. I used the darkest gray closest to the flowers, and then I overlapped those dots and extended closer to the center with a lighter gray, and then one more time with the lightest gray. So then came sentiment time. I went through all the stamp sets and I couldn't find a tall, skinny sentiment that would sit nicely in that remaining space. I actually got so frustrated that I took a break and walked away. And then it hit me. I could repeat a sentiment. I cut one of the stitch dot rectangle dies and I put it in my mini MISTI. To add some interest, I decided to give it an ombre look with 3 shades of Catherine Pooler brown inks, but I didn't want to have to measure. So here's my lazy measuring tip. First, make sure the sentiment will actually fit 3 times. Next, stamp the top sentiment. Then, stamp the bottom sentiment, making sure it's about the same distance from the bottom as the first one is from the top. Finally, place the middle sentiment in between the two, making sure that the spacing is even. See? I couldn't have got it better spaced if I had planned it and done all that math. By the way, that thank you is from the Delightful Sentiment set. To finish the card, I popped up the sentiment panel with foam tape, and I put the whole thing onto a white card base. And my final result is a card that doesn't look lazy at all. Do you have lazy tips that you use to make your crafting more efficient? I'd love to hear them. Leave me a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up below and subscribe to my channel for more inspiration. Product links are below in the description and also on my blog. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.